There's something almost heartbreaking about ambition that's doomed from the start. Picture this. It's 1942, and Adolf Hitler is standing on a windswept beach in northern France, gazing out at the English Channel. The waves are crashing against the shore, and he's dreaming of something impossible. A wall. Not just any wall, mind you, but what he calls the greatest fortification of all time. 2,500 miles of concrete and steel, stretching from the fjords of Norway all the way down to the Spanish border. 15,000 bunkers, millions of tons of concrete, all to keep the Allies from setting foot on European soil. But here's the thing that gets me, and maybe it'll get you too. This wasn't just about military strategy. This was about a man's desperate need to believe he could control the uncontrollable, to build something so massive, so permanent, that it would last 1,000 years. Of course, it didn't even last 3. I'm going to tell you a story today. It's the story of the Atlantic Wall, how it came to be, why Hitler believed in it so completely, and ultimately why it failed so spectacularly. But more than that, it's a story about human nature, about the difference between what looks impressive on paper and what actually works when the shooting starts. Because in many ways, it's not just about Hitler or World War II. It's about all of us, and the walls we build, thinking they'll keep the world at bay. Let me take you back to December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. You remember that day, don't you? The Japanese had just sucker-punched the United States Navy, and suddenly America was in the war whether we liked it or not. But if you were sitting in Hitler's bunker that December morning, you might have been feeling pretty good. Your Japanese allies had just knocked out the American Pacific Fleet. Britain was hanging on by a thread. The Soviet Union was reeling. There was just one little problem that kept nagging at Hitler's mind. Something that would grow into an obsession, consuming millions of tons of concrete and hundreds of thousands of lives. The British were still there, right across that narrow stretch of water we call the English Channel, 21 miles at its narrowest point. And Winston Churchill was not the type to give up easily. Now, Hitler wasn't stupid. Megalomaniacal, yes, but stupid? No. He knew that sooner or later the British would try to come back. And when America got its act together, which it would, because Americans always do, they'd be coming too. So picture Hitler walking along the beaches of northern France in early 1942, his boots crunching on sand and shingle. And as he's walking, he's thinking about Napoleon. See, Napoleon had the same problem 140 years earlier. He'd conquered most of Europe just like Hitler, but he could never quite finish off the British. They kept sailing around in their ships, causing trouble. Hitler wasn't about to make the same mistake. "I am the greatest builder of fortifications of all time," he declared. And for a brief moment, standing there on that French beach, he probably believed it. He was going to build a wall so magnificent, so impregnable, that no army on earth could break through it. He called it the Atlantic Wall. What Hitler didn't understand was the difference between a good idea and an obsession, between adequate defense and megalomaniacal fantasy. A reasonable man might have said, "Let's build some strong points at the most likely invasion sites." But Hitler wasn't a reasonable man. He was a man who thought in terms of thousand-year Reichs. So instead of building what was needed, he decided to build everything. Everywhere. All at once. And that was where things started to go terribly wrong. Let me introduce you to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. In March of 1942, Hitler gave him what might have been the most impossible job in military history. "Build me a wall," Hitler said, "from Norway to Spain. Make it impregnable." Von Rundstedt was old-school Prussian, 67 years old, with a mind sharp enough to cut glass. He'd been fighting wars since before World War I, and he understood something that Hitler couldn't grasp. You can't defend everywhere. It's one of those simple truths that seem obvious once you hear it. Isn't it? You can't defend everywhere. Because if you try to be strong everywhere, you end up being weak everywhere. But try explaining that to Adolf Hitler in 1942. Von Rundstedt did the math. The Atlantic coastline from Norway to Spain stretches for about 4,000 miles. To properly defend every mile of it, you'd need more men than Germany had. More concrete than Germany could produce. He tried to explain this to Hitler. "Mein Führer," he said, We need to concentrate our forces at the most likely landing points. We need mobile reserves. Hitler's response? Build it all. What followed was one of the largest construction projects in human history. 15 million cubic yards of concrete. That's enough to build a sidewalk 3 feet wide from New York to Los Angeles and back again twice. 1,200 bunkers just in the Normandy sector alone. But here's the human cost that really gets to you. To build this monstrosity, the Germans forced over 500,000 foreign workers into slave labor. Frenchmen, Russians, Poles, Czechs. Men torn from their families and forced to build the very fortifications that would keep their liberators at bay. There was a French engineer named Pierre Bouchard. He was forced to work on bunker construction near Calais. Every day, he'd wake up in a labor camp, march to the construction site, and spend 12 hours mixing concrete. But Pierre was clever. While he was building Hitler's wall during the day, he was memorizing every detail at night. The thickness of the concrete, the placement of gun ports, the location of ammunition storage areas. When the war was over, Pierre drew detailed plans of every bunker he'd helped build. Plans that later helped investigators understand just how flawed the construction had been. Because that's the thing about forced labor. When you make people build something against their will, they're not exactly motivated to do their best work. The bunkers looked impressive from the outside. But look closer and you'd start to notice things. Reinforcing bars that weren't quite properly placed. Concrete that wasn't quite the right mixture. The Atlantic Wall looked formidable, but it was being built by people who had every reason to want it to fail. There's a letter von Rundstedt wrote to his wife in late 1943. He writes about feeling like he's trying to hold back the ocean with his bare hands. "I am building a wall," he wrote, "but I fear it is made of sand." He was right to be afraid. Picture this scene with me. It's March 1944, and two of Germany's most capable military minds are standing in a bunker near Omaha Beach, having the kind of argument that would doom the Atlantic Wall before the first Allied soldier ever set foot on French soil. On one side, you have Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, probably the most respected German general of the entire war. On the other side, you have von Rundstedt, the old Prussian, brilliant in his own right, but representing a more traditional school of military thinking. They were arguing about tanks, specifically where to put the German panzer reserves when the invasion came. Rommel's position was simple, based on hard experience fighting the British in North Africa. He'd seen what Allied air power could do to moving columns of tanks. The enemy must be destroyed on the beaches, Rommel insisted, in the first 24 hours, before they can establish a foothold. His plan was to station the panzer divisions right behind the Atlantic Wall, close enough to counterattack within hours. Hit the Allies while they were still struggling to get off the beaches. It wasn't a bad plan. In fact, it was probably the only plan that had any real chance of success.
Von Rundstedt disagreed.
His approach was more traditional. Let the Allies land, he argued. Let them commit their forces. Then concentrate your reserves and hit them with everything you've got. We must not fritter away our armor in penny packets, von Rundstedt argued. But von Rundstedt was thinking in terms of 1940, not 1944. By 1944, the Allies had achieved complete air superiority over Western Europe. During daylight hours, nothing could move on the roads without being spotted and attacked by Allied fighters and bombers. Rommel understood this. He knew that any German reserve force trying to move from central France to the coast would be cut to pieces long before it reached the battlefield. So what did Hitler do? Did he choose one approach or the other? Of course not. Hitler split the difference and satisfied no one. Some panzer divisions were stationed close to the coast, as Rommel wanted. Others were held in central reserve, as von Rundstedt preferred. And here's the killer: Hitler insisted that the central reserves could only be moved with his personal approval. Think about that. You're a German tank commander 50 miles from the Normandy coast. The invasion begins at dawn. By the time the news reaches Hitler's bunker in East Prussia, gets debated by his staff, then finally results in movement orders, well, the Allies have had all day to establish their beachhead. It was a command structure designed for paralysis. And paralysis in modern warfare is death. But there was an even deeper problem with the Atlantic Wall. Hitler believed in fortress mentality, the idea that you could build walls high enough, thick enough, strong enough to keep out any threat. But fortress mentality has a fatal flaw. It's passive. It hands the initiative to your enemy. It lets them choose when and where and how to attack. The Allies understood this. Their strategy wasn't to break through the Atlantic Wall by brute force. It was to make the wall irrelevant. Instead of attacking where the wall was strongest, they would attack where it was weakest. Instead of trying to capture heavily fortified ports, they would build their own artificial harbors. Instead of fighting on Germany's terms, they would force Germany to fight on theirs. Hitler thought he was building a shield. What he actually built was a trap that would catch his own forces when the Allies finally came calling. The greatest fortification of all time was about to meet the greatest deception operation in history. Now here's where this story gets really interesting, because while Hitler was pouring concrete along the French coast, the Allies were cooking up something that would make all that concrete about as useful as a chocolate teapot. They were going to lie to him, magnificently, comprehensively. The operation was called Bodyguard, and it was based on a simple insight. Sometimes, the best way to get someone to do what you want is to make them think they're doing what they want. The Allies knew Hitler was expecting an invasion. They couldn't hide that. What they could hide was where that invasion would come. And the beauty of it was, Hitler's own prejudices would do most of the work for them. See, if you were sitting in Berlin in 1944, looking at a map of Western Europe, one landing site would jump out at you immediately.
The Pas de Calais.
The closest point between England and France. The shortest sea crossing, the most direct route to Germany. It was so obvious that it was almost insulting to German intelligence to suggest the Allies would attack anywhere else. So the Allies decided to be irrational. They would land at Normandy, 150 miles to the west. A longer sea crossing, more difficult terrain, farther from Germany. But to make that work, they had to convince Hitler that Normandy was just a feint, a diversionary attack designed to draw German forces away from the real landing at Calais. What followed was the most elaborate deception operation in military history. First, they created an entire fake army, the First United States Army Group, or FUSAG. On paper, it was commanded by General George Patton, whom the Germans considered the Allies' best attacking general. It was stationed in Kent, directly across from Calais. But FUSAG existed only in the imagination of Allied intelligence officers. The radio traffic was generated by a handful of signal operators, carefully scripted to sound like the communications of a massive military formation. The headquarters was a collection of empty buildings, and German reconnaissance flights saw exactly what the Allies wanted them to see. Fields full of tanks, harbors packed with landing craft, airfields crowded with aircraft, all fake, every last bit of it. The tanks were inflatable rubber. The landing craft were plywood. The aircraft were canvas and wood frames. But from 3,000 feet up, they looked real enough. The level of detail was extraordinary. The fake tanks left real tracks in the mud. The fake aircraft had ground crews who would move them around periodically. The fake landing craft were even painted with fake rust stains and battle damage. But the really clever part was the double agents. The Germans thought they had a network of spies operating in Britain. And they did, except those spies were working for the British. There was a Spanish businessman codenamed Garbo, who fed the Germans intelligence about Allied preparations. Garbo reported troop movements, supply buildups, training exercises, all meticulously accurate except for one small detail. Everything he reported pointed to Calais as the invasion target. All of them were feeding the Germans exactly what British intelligence wanted them to hear. And the Germans were eating it up. Here's the thing about deception operations. They work best when they tell people what they already want to believe. And Hitler desperately wanted to believe that the Allies would attack at Calais. Why? Because Calais was where he built his strongest defenses. If the Allies attacked at Calais, Hitler could crush them on the beaches. So when German intelligence reported massive Allied buildups pointing toward Calais, Hitler didn't question it. When his spies reported that George Patton was commanding the forces opposite Calais, Hitler nodded in satisfaction. Everything was going according to his plan. Except, of course, none of it was real. So even after D-Day began, even after Allied forces were pouring ashore at Normandy, the double agents continued to insist that this was just a diversionary attack. The real invasion, they reported, was still coming at Calais. And incredibly, Hitler believed them. For weeks after D-Day, Hitler kept his strongest forces positioned at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. While his men in Normandy were fighting for their lives, his best divisions sat idle, protecting empty beaches from an imaginary threat. It was the perfect deception. It worked because it exploited Hitler's greatest weakness, his absolute conviction that he was smarter than everyone else, and that, more than any engineering flaw, was what doomed the Atlantic Wall. It was built to defend against an attack that Hitler expected, at a place where Hitler wanted to fight. But the Allies weren't going to give him that satisfaction. When they did attack, all those millions of tons of concrete would prove about as useful as sandcastles at high tide. You know, there are moments in history when you can almost feel the world shifting on its axis. June 6, 1944, 6:30 in the morning, was one of those moments. Let me paint you a picture of what the Atlantic Wall looked like that morning. All along the Normandy coast, German sentries were peering out of their bunkers into the pre-dawn gloom. It had been a rough night. Storms had been lashing the coast for days. Most of the guards figured it would be another quiet morning. After all, who would be crazy enough to launch an invasion in weather like this? That's when the shapes began to emerge from the mist. At first, it was just a few dark smudges on the horizon. Maybe fishing boats, some guards thought. But as the light grew stronger and the mist began to clear, those smudges resolved into something that must have made those German boys' blood run cold. Ships, hundreds of them, thousands of them, the largest armada in human history, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. At 5:50 a.m., the Allied naval bombardment began. Picture the loudest thunderstorm you've ever experienced. Now multiply that by 100. USS Texas, USS Arkansas, HMS Warspite battleships whose guns were bigger than anything the Atlantic Wall had ever faced. The concrete bunkers, those massive structures that were supposed to be impregnable, shook like houses in an earthquake. But here's the thing that really gets to me about that morning. For all its sound and fury, the naval bombardment didn't actually destroy much of the Atlantic Wall. When the smoke cleared, most of the guns were still operational. The Atlantic Wall's first real test, and it had passed, sort of. At 6:30 a.m., the first landing craft hit the beaches. And that's when the Atlantic Wall's fatal flaws became apparent. Take Utah Beach. The 4th Infantry Division was supposed to land directly in front of the strongest part of the German defenses. But the current carried them a mile south, where the defenses were much lighter. What should have been a disaster turned into a relatively easy landing. The Atlantic Wall was designed for predictability. It assumed the Allies would attack exactly where the Germans expected them to attack. When reality proved messier than the plan, the rigid fortifications couldn't adapt. At Omaha Beach, the story was different. Here, the Americans landed almost exactly where the Germans expected them to. And for a few terrifying hours, it looked like the Atlantic Wall might actually work. The beach was a killing field. German machine guns in concrete bunkers swept the sand with interlocking fields of fire. American soldiers huddled behind beach obstacles, pinned down, taking casualties with every passing minute. But then something happened that the German planners had never anticipated. American soldiers began to improvise. They didn't try to assault the bunkers head-on, as the Germans expected. Instead, small groups worked their way around to the flanks. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the wire. They called in naval gunfire. Most importantly, they refused to give up. There's a story I heard from a veteran of the 116th Infantry Regiment. His name was Charlie Henderson, from Bedford, Virginia. Charlie told me about watching his buddies get cut down on that beach, about lying in the sand with bullets whistling overhead. But then he saw something that changed everything. An old sergeant stood up in the middle of all that machine gun fire and shouted, "Are we going to lie here and get shot, or are we going to get up and do something about it?" One by one, the men around Charlie started getting up. Not because they weren't scared, they were terrified. But because sometimes, when things are at their worst, ordinary people find extraordinary courage. And that's something you can't defend against with concrete and steel. You can't build a wall high enough to stop human determination. By noon on June 6th, American forces had broken through the Omaha defenses. Not because the Atlantic Wall had failed mechanically, most of the bunkers were still intact, but because the men inside those bunkers, they were facing Americans who refused to quit. And that was why the Atlantic Wall was doomed from the moment the first Allied soldier set foot on Norman sand. You can build walls to keep out armies, but you can't build walls to keep out ideas. And the idea that was landing on those beaches that morning, the idea of freedom, of liberation, that was more powerful than all the concrete in Hitler's Atlantic Wall. I've spent a lot of time talking about strategy and engineering, but there's another side to this story that deserves our attention, the human side, the cost in lives and suffering that Hitler's folly demanded. Let me tell you about Hans Müller. Not his real name, I've changed it to protect his family's privacy. But Hans was typical of the men who found themselves stationed along the Atlantic Wall in 1944. He was 43 years old, a baker from a small town in Bavaria. He'd been drafted in 1943, given 6 weeks of basic training, and shipped off to a bunker near Le Havre to wait for an invasion that might never come. Hans had never fired a shot in anger. He'd never seen combat. His bunker was supposed to hold 12 men, but it actually held 8 because that's all the manpower the Germans could spare. The gun Hans was supposed to operate was a Czech-made artillery piece from 1938. Half the time, it wouldn't fire at all because the ammunition didn't quite fit properly. When it did fire, Hans couldn't see what he was shooting at because the bunker's observation slit faced the wrong direction. So he had to rely on directions shouted from a spotter in another bunker, assuming the telephone lines hadn't been cut by Allied bombing. I want you to picture Hans Müller on the morning of June 6, 1944. He's been awakened at dawn by the sound of distant explosions. He stumbles up the concrete stairs to his gun position. He peers through the observation slit and sees something that must have stopped his heart cold. Ships, hundreds of ships, covering the horizon from left to right as far as he can see. He grabs the telephone to call his headquarters. Dead.
No di alto.
He tries the radio. Static. So there's Hans, a 43-year-old baker from Bavaria, standing in a concrete bunker that was supposed to be impregnable, holding a Czech gun that barely works, with no way to communicate with anyone, watching the largest armada in human history approaching the beach below. Now multiply Hans Müller by 50,000, because that's roughly how many men were manning the Atlantic Wall on D-Day. Not crack SS troops, not battle-hardened veterans, just ordinary men, many of them middle-aged, many of them foreign conscripts who had no particular desire to die for Hitler's dream. There were Russians who'd been captured on the Eastern Front and given the choice between a POW camp and service in the German army. There were Poles who'd been drafted whether they liked it or not. There were teenage boys and old men from the Volkssturm, Germany's last-ditch home guard units. You want to know why the Atlantic Wall failed? This is why. You can build the most impressive fortifications in the world, but if you don't have the right people to man them, you're just building very expensive monuments to your own vanity. The tragic irony is that Hitler had the men he needed. German forces on D-Day still numbered in the millions. There were elite panzer divisions sitting in reserve around Paris, but they weren't where they needed to be. And then there were the forced laborers. The Atlantic Wall consumed more than concrete and steel. It consumed human lives on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Conservative estimates suggest that over 20,000 forced laborers died during its construction. Worked to death, starved, or simply killed when they became too weak to be useful. Hans wrote letters home to his wife in Bavaria. The censors read every word, so he couldn't say much. But between the lines, you can feel his growing despair. But then, in his last letter home, "Kiss Greta for me. Tell her Papa is thinking of her. Always thinking of her." Hans Müller never saw his daughter again. He was killed on June 7, 1944, when American forces overran his position. He was 43 years old. Today, there are memorials scattered along the Norman coast. not just to Allied soldiers who died in the liberation, but to the forced laborers who died building Hitler's wall, to the German soldiers who were sacrificed defending it, to the French civilians who suffered under occupation. All victims, in their own ways, of one man's grandiose delusion. Standing among those memorials, you can't help but think about the terrible waste of it all. The lives lost, the resources squandered, the suffering inflicted, all for a wall that never had a chance of working. I've been thinking about this story for decades now, and there's something about the Atlantic Wall that reminds me of so many other human endeavors that started with good intentions and ended in disappointment. Hitler's Atlantic Wall failed for reasons that go far deeper than engineering or tactics. It failed because of human nature, specifically the very human tendency to believe that if you just build something big enough, strong enough, impressive enough, you can control things that are fundamentally uncontrollable. Think about it from Hitler's perspective. By 1942, his empire was starting to fray at the edges. The Russians weren't collapsing as quickly as he'd expected. The Americans were mobilizing faster than he'd hoped. The British were proving annoyingly resilient. For a man who'd built his entire identity around the idea that willpower could overcome any obstacle, these setbacks must have been deeply unsettling. So what did he do? He turned to concrete. Concrete doesn't retreat. Concrete doesn't question orders. Concrete doesn't lose morale. If you build enough of it, thick enough, strong enough, surely it will solve your problems. It's a very human response. When we feel overwhelmed by forces beyond our control, we often turn to building walls. Sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically. But the Atlantic Wall reveals the fundamental flaw in this approach. Walls are static. Life is dynamic. Walls assume that tomorrow's threats will look exactly like today's threats. But threats evolve, adapt, find new ways around old obstacles. The Allies didn't try to break through the Atlantic Wall because they understood something Hitler didn't. In the modern world, the strongest defense isn't the one that can't be broken. It's the one that can adapt. There's another psychological element to the story that I find particularly American. It's the element of ingenuity triumphing over brute force. While Hitler was pouring concrete, American engineers were solving problems. How do you supply an invasion force without capturing a port? Build artificial harbors. How do you clear minefields under fire? Invent flail tanks. How do you fool enemy intelligence? Create dummy armies with inflatable tanks. Every problem was met with innovation. Every obstacle was turned into an opportunity. It was American pragmatism at its finest, the belief that there's no problem so big it can't be solved with enough ingenuity and hard work. And that's something you can't defend against with static fortifications. You can't build a wall thick enough to stop a good idea whose time has come. The Atlantic Wall failed because it represented the exact opposite of everything we believe in. Hitler's wall was about exclusion, about keeping people out, keeping ideas out, keeping change out. It was about saying this far and no farther to the forces of history. America has always been about inclusion, about bringing people in, welcoming new ideas, embracing change as an opportunity rather than a threat. Our greatest achievements have come not from building walls, but from tearing them down. When American soldiers stormed those Norman beaches, they weren't just fighting against German concrete and steel. They were fighting against an entire worldview. A worldview that said some people matter more than others, that said might makes right. And when those soldiers broke through Hitler's defenses, they weren't just winning a military victory. They were proving that the American way, messy, chaotic, democratic, but ultimately unstoppable, was stronger than any wall a dictator could build. That's why the Atlantic Wall failed. Not because it was poorly engineered, though it was. Not because it was inadequately manned, though it was. But because it represented an idea whose time had passed. The future belonged to those who could adapt, innovate, and overcome. Not to those who hid behind walls. I've been thinking about this story for a long time now, and I keep coming back to the same question. What does the Atlantic Wall teach us about today? We're not fighting World War II anymore. Hitler is long dead. The Nazi regime is a historical footnote, and the beaches of Normandy are tourist destinations rather than battlefields. But human nature hasn't changed much in the past 80 years, has it? We still see leaders who believe they can solve complex problems with simple solutions. We still see politicians promising to build walls, literal or metaphorical, to keep out threats they don't understand. We still see people who think that if you just make something big enough, strong enough, impressive enough, it will solve all your problems. And we still see the same results. Projects that look magnificent on paper but fall apart when they meet reality. Strategies that impress supporters but fail to achieve their objectives. The Atlantic Wall wasn't unique because it was German or because it was built in the 1940s. It was unique only in its scale. The underlying mistakes, the confusion of appearance with effectiveness, the preference for rigid solutions over flexible ones, these mistakes are timeless. I'm old enough to remember when people said the Berlin Wall would last forever. When experts explained that East and West Germany would never be reunited because the barriers between them were too strong to overcome. I was there when the Berlin Wall came down. I watched on television as ordinary people with hammers and pickaxes tore apart what had been called an impregnable barrier. I saw families reunited after decades of separation. And I thought about the Atlantic Wall and how quickly even the most impressive fortifications can become irrelevant when history decides to move in a different direction. That's the real lesson of the Atlantic Wall. The future has a way of making even the most carefully constructed barriers obsolete. The world changes. Technology advances. People adapt. New ideas emerge that make old solutions irrelevant. And that's something Americans have always understood better than most. We've never been a nation that believed in permanent barriers. We've been a nation that believed in permanent change. Our ancestors crossed oceans to get here. They crossed mountains and deserts to explore this continent. When they encountered obstacles, their instinct wasn't to build walls around them. It was to find ways over, under, or around them. That's the American way. Not to accept limitations, but to overcome them. Not to build fortresses, but to build bridges. Not to fear the future, but to embrace it. The boys who stormed those Norman beaches understood this instinctively. They weren't fighting to preserve the status quo. They were fighting to create a better world. And in large measure, they succeeded. The world we live in today, with its global communications, its international trade, its cultural exchanges, is the world they fought to create. It's not a perfect world. There are still walls being built, still barriers being erected, still leaders who think they can control the future by building impressive-looking obstacles. But the Atlantic Wall reminds us that these walls are temporary, that barriers can be overcome, that the human desire for freedom and connection is stronger than any fortification ever built. The next time you're feeling overwhelmed by the walls in your own life, whether they're physical, economic, social, or psychological, remember the Atlantic Wall. Remember that even Hitler's greatest fortification of all time couldn't stop determined people who refused to accept that walls were permanent. Remember that walls are built by people, and what people build, other people can tear down. That's the real legacy of D-Day. The demonstration that human courage and ingenuity can overcome even the most impressive-looking obstacles. The Atlantic Wall failed because it was based on the assumption that the world could be controlled, contained, made predictable. But the world is not controllable. It's not containable. It's certainly not predictable. The world is changeable, and that's not something to fear. It's something to celebrate. Because in a world that changes, walls don't last. But bridges do. So here's what I want you to do. Here's what those boys who stormed the beaches of Normandy would want you to do. Look around you. Look at the walls in your own life, in your community, in our country. Not just the physical ones, but the invisible ones. The walls of division. The walls of us versus them. The walls that say it can't be done or things will never change. And remember this story. Remember that the most impressive-looking barriers in history, built by the most powerful empire of its time, defended by millions of soldiers, fortified with the best technology available, crumbled in a single day when faced with people who refused to accept that those barriers were permanent. Those American soldiers didn't storm those beaches because they were fearless. They were terrified. They didn't succeed because they were superhuman. They were ordinary people bakers and farmers, teachers and factory workers. Just like you, just like your neighbors. What made them extraordinary was their refusal to accept that walls were the final answer. Their belief that tomorrow could be better than today. Their faith that ordinary people working together could overcome any obstacle. That spirit, that uniquely American spirit, it's not buried in the sand of Normandy beaches. It's not locked away in history books. It's alive today. It's in you. It's in your children and grandchildren. It's in every American who still believes that we can build bridges instead of walls. So don't just remember D-Day as something that happened 80 years ago to other people. Remember it as a promise. A promise that walls, no matter how high, how thick, how intimidating, are temporary. But the human spirit? That's permanent. The next time someone tells you that division is inevitable, that problems are too big to solve, that walls are the only answer, you tell them about the Atlantic Wall. You tell them about Hitler's greatest fortification of all time and how it lasted exactly one day against people who believed in something better. And then you do what Americans have always done best. You get to work building bridges, because that's who we are. That's who we've always been. And that's who we'll always be, as long as we remember the lesson of Normandy. Walls don't last, but the courage to tear them down, that lasts forever.